Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here and for participating with us in this conversation. I really feel like I should just say what he said. But in terms of just sort of trying to frame my remarks, let me start by saying this is all very much thinking out loud. But in trying to think about this question of whether or not there's a tension between where we were and where we are, whether or not this is contiguous, I think foregrounding this question for me sort of began with trying to think about Trump versus neoliberalism ? And in trying to dig into that, I think my intuition has taken me to the idea that on the one hand, while we have traditionally been thought to track or to think about colorblindness in opposition to white nationalism, in fact, what we're witnessing is the way in which colorblindness is tracking through and enabling white nationalism. And it's important for us to sort of, I think, map that not as only a domestic project, but as the earlier panel talked about, as one in which there are global dimensions. So I start by saying it may be hard to recall before the election, but before the election, the financial markets and the gurus on Wall Street were all backing Clinton, and they were discounting what appeared to be an implausible Trump victory. Business projections said, you know, if Trump wins, the market's going to fall, and it was even unthinkable that this would happen. But this anxiety seemed to be confirmed at least instantly right after the election in the aftershock when the market indicators fell. But as you may know, they've climbed back up and in fact broke through some magical mystery, whatever level that is supposed to, I don't know, it's a big number and they broke through it. Okay. So anyway, in short order, one way of understanding why this market fell and why it was so quick to recover is that the markets were reflecting the uncertain nature of the relationship between Trumpism as a form of racist populism and white nationalism on the one hand, and neoliberalism's alliance with colorblindness on the other. These seeming tensions between neoliberalism's colorblind racial logic and the embrace of open borders as the key to open markets and the flow of capital was seen to be somewhat in tension with white nationalism and Trump. So to some extent, maybe what we were witnessing is this, the extent to which he has destabilized the equilibrium, because we know that what neoliberalism hates is uncertainty, even though it constantly reproduces it, and undermines legitimacy and threatens profit. So we can think about his ascendancy as threatening a neoliberal consensus in a couple of respects. So one, the idea that neoliberalism always knows best, right? And that it promotes privatization as the best means of securing the public welfare. So what had been considered social welfare functions of the state, healthcare, education, the environment, all are supposed to be better and more efficiently delivered through the market. But of course, the key omission in this story is that markets fail. And when they fail, the market relies upon and indeed merges with the state in order to save itself. So while privatization under neoliberalism has long involved the conversion of the public fisc into private capital, right? That's what they've been doing, just taking the money and putting it in their pocket. 2008 produced a crisis of legitimacy around the neoliberal dogma, a crisis which helped propel Obama to power. So 2008 also revealed the perils of globalization, and containing the crisis proved impossible, and so the pain was worldwide. And in contrast to the opening of the public coffers for bailing out Wall Street, main streets throughout the world and the people who live on them were largely left to fend for themselves, as debt relief for working people was called a moral hazard, right? So the claim that neoliberalism knows best and that the protection of the uber capitalist class protects individual freedom could seem to be under some kind of pressure from Trump's critique of the corporate class, which in one respect was not wrong, but as it turns out did not represent any significant threat, because the swamp has been relocated to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and the Goldman Sachs of the world are working feverishly to avoid any form of accountability, transparency, or limits in the extraction of profits through debt. The second thing that neoliberalism argued was that you had to really get government out of a lot of these functions because they were inefficient and corrupt. So on this view, governmental corruption impedes the proper function of markets. And so you can recall neoliberalism's critique of regimes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, for endemic corruption because they fail to draw any distinction between the interest of the state and its citizens on the one hand and the business interest of its leaders on the other. Well, now guess who's the primary example? An exhibit of kleptocracy with the merger of Trump Inc. with the Trump presidency. So his children, who will formally run his business while he's in office, are getting top secret clearance, and the US presidency is now a global brand. So in some respect, you can see that maybe this isn't exactly what neoliberalism mapped out. Undoubtedly, there's also some internal tension here, I guess is what I'm saying, between this America First idea and the neoliberal notion of open borders as the key to the flow of capital. But as I said, there's some signs of détente, given what's populating the cabinet. And I guess Goldman Sachs can become the consigliere to the first family. So now thinking about colorblindness to white nationalism, so neoliberalism's project operated through, as Noah said, the racial framework of colorblindness. Race did not and should not matter. That's what we were told. And the election of Obama, while a reflection of an expression of a lot of racial work, was really projected as a conveyance of the idea that we had transcended race. We can also see how this converged with the interest of the dominant class post the 2008 crisis, which needed to stabilize the system, and they needed a colored person to do it. What I mean by that is to say, in order to convey the message that we had truly transcended race, it was important that a non-white racial subject make that point. I'm not talking about what Obama himself argued. I'm talking about what the symbolic meaning of this is, and I'm looking to my colleague Sumi Cho to thank her for a contribution in terms of thinking about post-racialism as a new and improved form of colorblindness that had emerged in reaction to the conservative form of colorblindness in the previous period. It's important to recall, however, that the key components of Trumpism were incubated by the Republican Party platform over the past decade, and I'm going to cut through that because I've just got a 3-minute warning, which I cannot believe. Trumpism's America First may critique globalization as a feature and strategy of neoliberalism's relentless pursuit of profit, but it's also clear that his alt-right project is global in character, right? So he's mobilizing white victimhood through a language of national reclamation and rescue from the invasion of the non-white hordes and from the internal threat, the fifth column created by neoliberalism's free trade policy. So in some extent, we see this as consistent with Farage and Brexit, with Wilders in the Netherlands, with Le Pen and the National Front, all of whom portray themselves and their parties as protection of the Volk, the people, from the predations of cosmopolitan and traitorous global elites who've been willing to sacrifice the true national interest. So you have making America great again is contiguous with making Britain great again, with making Russia great again. These are all hyper-nationalist, xenophobic projects. I wanted to talk about the case of France, but I'm going to skip that for a moment because I'll try to bring this dynamic, I try to make one comment and bring it closer to home. So this way in which colorblindness sort of moves into and enables white nationalism is really interesting when you think about France, which has long resisted the notion of the relevance of race to understanding division in French society. They have a very aggressive form of colorblindness. But as Arun Kundani argues in an essay called Recharging the Batteries of Whiteness, France of the 1980s has been a particularly productive location for right resurgence in Europe because they stopped the right stopped claiming sort of Nazi symbolism and running around in old SS uniforms, and instead anointed itself as the front line in protecting the national identity, the cultural identity of France from invasive forces of immigration, creating an internal other that threatens the white identity of the nation. And so he says, they've been successful since the 1990s, quote, particularly in the shadow of the war on terror, far-right movements across Western Europe have learned from the National Front. They've understood how the seemingly non-racist language of culture and ethnicity can be used to engage the mythological power of white victimhood. So if we were to think about this dynamic closer to home, and I'm going to take the liberty of just a couple more minutes to illustrate the domestic dimensions of this phenomenon, I want to consider a tale of sort of two cities, if you will, one being New Orleans post-Katrina, and one being a city or an area that's described in Arlie Hochschild's new book, Strangers in Their Own Land, which is talking about an area of southeast Louisiana which has been really impacted by environmental degradation in a very serious way, and yet has a very, very hard right political conservative character. She spends 5 years talking with these people, sort of as a classic ethnography, trying to figure out how they arrive at their political position when it seems to be as though it's exactly against their interest. So on the one hand, in New Orleans, what you have is sort of the colorblind, what I call colorblind deconstruction in the wake of Katrina. And so the specific institution that I was looking at is education. So what happened in the wake of Katrina to the New Orleans education system? The answer is it was wiped out. It was turned into an entirely charter school system. 7,500 people were laid off. The litigation has gone on for several years without success. I can go into the particulars in Q&A, but it was in an emergency session of the Louisiana legislature. They basically did this in the dark of the night when people were still scattered all over the country. And it was very much a neoliberal model, but it was carried out through a colorblind agenda, meaning they defined the criteria for how to do this in terms that never once mentioned race, but very specifically were targeted at New Orleans. So that's on the one hand. And then what Arlie is talking about, on the other, is very interesting because she's looking at the way in which environmental degradation, as I said, has wiped out these people's communities. And yet, she says, they seem to be continually committed to this kind of notion of resisting any kind of state intervention on their own behalf. So what explains this dilemma? Well, she says it's a kind of a deep story, a frame or a narrative that they've adopted that helps them make sense of their worldview. So while they're not completely blind to questions of corporate exploitation, they have a deep story whose critique of corporate power pales, and I mean that all pun intended, in comparison with their critique of government and particularly of the regulatory state, which takes us back to the question that Anya was talking about before, which is why is the destruction of the administrative state a white nationalist project? So paradoxically, in a state that has gutted its welfare system and eviscerated its state environmental protection agency and transferred millions to the oil and gas industry, this is all fine with these folks. And the narrative that they tell is that basically they're more mad at government than they are at corporations. I mean, and they're more mad at government because government is unfair in dispensing its benefits to line cutters. So their idea is, we've been standing in the queue, we've been waiting, we've been following the rules, and along come these line cutters, and the government gives out all these benefits. Well, guess what color the line colors are, right? So she notes the fact that they do not mention race a lot, but it's very clear that this is a racialized other that is a threat to their sort of world and worldview. So this comes back to the question of the wages of whiteness and the extent to which the operation of government is seen as threatening to the wages of whiteness. So white privilege then, which has always been unevenly distributed among whites, is grounded in a set of expectations regarding status, living standards, in which neoliberalism has undermined and simultaneously affirmed as a birthright. So Trumpism has been preceded by the rise of the Tea Party under the slogan of the need to take our country back. What he has done is sharpened the message of racist populism to critique political elites for selling out the white working class to corporate interests, but that's only true by half, since it sold out all the working class, not just white people. In some ways, this is sort of a flip of the class not race argument that Noah alluded to earlier, which has been used to delegitimate race-conscious anti-discrimination law. The irony of this class not race analysis is that it further underwrites the white working class's misunderstanding of their oppression as a consequence of anti-white racism, right? So they're not seeing themselves shafted on the basis of their class position, but on their racial identity. I want to wrap up here because I know that I'm over time, but the one thing I also want to say that's striking to me about the book is its title, Strangers in Their Own Land. Now what's very interesting is that she centers this as the title of the book, but she does not do so with any irony whatsoever. And it leaves unchallenged their account of injury, which is rooted in a racialist narrative, which completely erases the settler colonial claim of ownership of the land on which they're claiming to own. This erasure of indigenous sovereignty is another way in which whiteness is working in this narrative, which is deeply profound and destructive and I think is worthy of our attention in terms of thinking about these trajectories. I'll stop here.